as the federal government relaxes lockdown in Federal Capital Territory, Lagos. Ogun. Nationwide curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. bans interstate movement, religious and social gatherings. 10 trillion naira lost to COVID-19 lockdown, LCCI DG. And then we move to leadership newspaper. Lockdown remains till Monday. President Muhammadu Buhari declares back 2 weeks lockdown or shutdown of Kano State. Says use of face masks are now compulsory. 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. curfew to be imposed in Abuja, Lagos, Ogun from May the 4th. No interstate movement except for essential services. And then we'll move on to the blueprint now. Buhari slams 2-week lockdown on Kano. Is his FCT Lagos Ogun halts interstate travel? Others use all face masks. Let's quickly move now to the Daily Times. Coronavirus reprieve as Buhari announces phased relaxation of lockdown. Review not applicable to Kano. Businesses to open from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. Says federal government will not tolerate rights abuses by security agents. And finally, the Daily Trust. COVID-19, Buhari allows 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. movements in states. Extends lockdown in Federal Capital Territory, Lagos, Ogun to May the 1st. Locks down Kano for 2 weeks. Partial interstate travels. Signs proclamation order. NLC doctors Afeni Ferry speak. All right. Ayodele, let's get your reaction to the president's statement yesterday. Talk to us, your interpretation of his speech. Was it what you expected?
I think that the president aptly captured the mood of the country, to take the decision, a very brave and courageous decision, I must say, to ease the lockdown starting from next week, because essentially we had to come to a point where we needed to balance public health and the economy generally. If you had noticed, in fact, the LCCI, that's the Lagos State Chamber of Commerce, had put out a statement that the economy had lost close to 10 trillion naira. If you looked at the report from the Guardian newspaper about last week, it said that travel agencies had run into a debt of over 180 billion naira, and the aviation industry was about to lose about 93,000 jobs. If you go on and on, you see that the hospitality industry had been bleeding, businesses had been closing shop, and fundamentally the fact that 60% of our economy is largely informal, which means that millions of Nigerians depend on a daily income to survive. We had to come to a point where we needed to localize our own solutions to fighting this pandemic. And so we had expected that sooner or later we're going to get to a point where we needed to balance the fight against COVID-19 with essentially keeping our economy afloat. So I must commend the president for the very courageous decision, and I say it's a very courageous decision to make, to begin to ease the lockdown, because we cannot at the risk of fighting the virus and now die of hunger and have people lose jobs in
all right, if I may interrupt your line of thoughts, Ayodele. Some persons had complained about certain gaps during the lockdown when it was in place, and how those gaps were not, hampering the efforts being put in place by the government. And now that this is being eased, are you confident that the balance that you mentioned or talked about earlier would certainly be achieved?
Well, it's going to be a very difficult period, I must say, and I don't think it's going to be an easy process for the governments, both the national and subnational governments. But what the government needs to do, especially the Lagos state government and state governors, is that they must step up advocacy. They must continue to be on the faces of their citizens to ensure that they are getting acquainted with the message of wearing the face mask, of social distancing, of avoiding crowded places, of maintaining very top hygiene, and all of that. And of course, they need to emphasize personal responsibility, because all of this will largely depend on individuals taking the personal responsibility to stay safe and be their brother's keeper. Because if people flout these regulations, if people do not take the precautionary measures very seriously, we're just going to end back up in square one. So I think the government has the job of ramping up a public campaign to teach people what to do, how to do them, when to do them, of course. And I even think they need to go a step further, to raise the campaign to teach people what to do should, in case they see signs um, of COVID-19, and how to take care of themselves at home, because world over 50% of the people who have recovered from this virus have done so by recovering at home and taking certain kinds of medication. So I think it is possible to achieve, but government needs to step up advocacy and ensure that it's in the faces of people, and Nigerians need to take personal responsibility for their safety and that of their neighbors and the country at large. And I think that if that can happen, there's a chance that we can pull through. But more importantly, government needs to expand its capacity to test, it needs to expand its capacity to trace, and it needs to expand its capacity to treat, so that at no point will it become overwhelmed, should, in case there is another outbreak of the virus in future. So the government needs to be prepared for every eventuality, and I'm sure that the NCDC will be working around the clock to ensure that they are not caught pants down.
Now, still talking balance, the president mentioned that the fact that security of lives is paramount, one of their top priority, and would not take lightly anything that has to do with perhaps extrajudicial killings and the infringement of those rights, especially with regards to the enforcement of the regulations in place. Now, how do we achieve a balance with regards to that, and what do you expect moving on from now?
Listen, I don't pretend that we can achieve that balance anytime soon, because even before you had the lockdown, you've had killings by rogue police officials and certain security agencies who have taken the laws into their hands. Kids have been killed needlessly on the streets of Lagos, Port Harcourt, Onitsha, and Ibadan, simply because they looked like internet fraudsters, or because they were at parties, or because they looked in a way that suggested that they were criminals. So it's an institutional problem, and it's a cultural problem that can only be changed by a reorientation, and a systemic change in the Nigerian police force, and of course in the Nigerian military. Except we reorient the officers and men of the Nigerian police, and of course the Nigerian army, to prioritize the life of every Nigerian, then we're still going to be running around the same circle. So I'm not hopeful that security agencies are going to put up their best behavior. All I'm going to ask is that the authorities should come down hard on those officers who flout the rule of law, and who flagrantly disregard the values of human life. And they really should be made an example of. So ultimately, I hope that government continues to prioritize the life of the average Nigerian, whether he's rich, poor, largely not depending on his social status or what strata of the society he finds himself. And we hope that that transcends into our security agencies, where they begin to see people as human beings first, as people who are part of a family, as people who are part of a larger society, and treat them with decency and with respect. And that way we can begin to make progress. So I think as of now, what Nigerians can do is to be of their best behavior, and so that they are obedient and observe, like I said earlier, on the precautionary measures, and not get into any confrontation with the security agencies. And of course, the security agencies on their own part must also be the adults in the room, put up their best behavior, and ensure that they who are in charge of enforcing the law must also not be seen as flouting the law.
All right, Ayodele Adio, we'll leave the discussion here now. Thank you for speaking with us. Time to take a look at stories making the headlines in Nigerian newspapers. And joining me via Skype is Ayodele Adio, Managing Editor, the Avalon Daily. Ayodele, thank you for joining us. Good morning once again.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's head straight to the papers now, and I begin with the news direct. Kano under lock as federal government relaxes lockdown in Federal Capital Territory. Lagos, Ogun imposes nationwide curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m., bans interstate movement, religious social gatherings, 10 trillion naira lost to COVID-19 lockdown, LCCIDG. And we move to the leadership newspaper. Lockdown remains till Monday, President Muhammadu Buhari declares. On to the blueprint now. Buhari slams 2-week lockdown on Kano, eases Federal Capital Territory, Lagos, Ogun, halts interstate travels, enters use of face mask, or rather orders use of face mask, hints on possible business resumption, says a ban on religious gatherings subsists. Kano rising case not surprising. NCDC, Agbakoba urges homegrown solutions. And to the Daily Times, coronavirus reprieve as Buhari announces phase relaxation of lockdown. Review not applicable to Kano. Businesses to open from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. Says federal government will not tolerate rights abuses by security agents. And finally, on the front page of the Daily Trust now, COVID-19, Buhari allows 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. movement in states, extends lockdown in Federal Capital Territory, Lagos, Ogun to May the 4th, locks down Kano for 2 weeks, partial interstate travels, signs proclamation order, NLC doctors Afenifere speak. All right, we'll look at the president's directive on Kano State, taking the story from the News Direct now, Ayadele. The president is locking down Kano State for 2 weeks. Is that a step, a strategy that you expected the government to take with regards to what is happening in Kano State that has become a source of concern?
Of course, it's no surprise. I think we all saw this coming. Before the president even issued the lockdown in Kano, I think the governor had already locked down the entire state for about 10 days before the president also announced the 2 weeks lockdown. So I think it was not surprising because the number of deaths that are coming out of Kano, quite alarming if you look at the number of deaths, even though it is claimed that there are no confirmation that those deaths are from COVID-19. But nevertheless, you can have a number of people dying in that number and not take precautionary measures. So I think it's a step in the right direction to lock down the state. But you see, locking down the state is not a solution in itself, because the idea of a lockdown is to first halt the spread of the infection and, of course, to increase your capacity to respond to the crisis. So it's not just locking down Kano State, it's for the government to also increase its capacity to test, to also increase its capacity to test contacts. It's also to increase its capacity in terms of hospital beds, ICU, and make sure that when people come to these hospitals and these intensive care centers, they are going to be catered for.
Now, there has been talks about domesticating measures and the use of community communicators to perhaps address the spread of COVID-19 across states. Now that the state is on a lockdown, what would you expect the government to do looking at that window using community communicators at this point?
I mean, they have to leverage on everything that they can, to fight this virus. And, I've always advocated for local solutions because of the peculiarity of our socio-political environment. We live in a predominantly poor country, so social distancing is a little more difficult in clustered communities. So that's why I advocate for localizing solutions wherein government will need to ramp up its public campaign to educate citizens of their personal responsibility, to fight this virus. You just cannot announce a shutdown without educating citizens and getting their buy-in as to why the entire state has to be on a lockdown, what they need to do, how they need to do it, and support them through the process. So what I would like to see, is a holistic plan, from government to enable the citizens understand the gravity of this issue. And I don't see that happening in places like Kano, for instance. A lot of people still think this thing is a hoax. A lot of people are still defying the lockdown. So I think that there needs to be a ramp up of public campaign for people to understand the gravity of the problem that they face, and for them to have a buy-in, because without personal responsibility, without people taking the precautionary measures, it will be an exercise in futility. So I think that it's important that there needs to be, some sort of social accountability process between the government and the people, to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And once people are on the same page, then they can be open up, to a lot of collaborative efforts with the government. And so government in itself, like I said, the emphasis is on government to ensure that it ramps up its capacity to deal with the problem. And this has to be in terms of your ability to test more people, your ability to trace contacts, and then your ability to provide treatment where necessary.
All right, let's look at lessons perhaps that we could learn from countries like Madagascar and Senegal that has come up with some homegrown solutions to tackling COVID-19 and perhaps flattening the curve, because in all of this, this is what we are trying to achieve. What lessons do you see we can learn? Because for Senegal, they also fought the Ebola virus, and from that lesson, they were able to come up with the solutions of trying to expand testing. What can we learn?
I mean, there's a whole lot that we can learn. I mean, too many learning points here. I like the fact that you talked about Senegal. And Senegal, from their battle against Ebola and other infectious diseases, they've been able to increase institutional capacity to respond to infectious diseases, and that's why they are able to come up with homegrown test kits. And of course, they've been able to produce ventilators that usually cost over $10,000 for less than $60. So that's a huge achievement, and that's because they've learned lessons from the Ebola crisis and institutionalized them and invested in research and development. So one of the lessons that we must take out of this is critical investment in our health systems in Nigeria. Without adequate investment in these health systems, our ability to respond to crises, will be less than pretty. What we need to do also is not just to invest in hospitals and clinics and staff salaries. We also must begin to invest in research institutions, because our ability to respond to crises in the future will rely on the intellectual capacity of the men and women of our health services who do the hard work of researching solutions to some of these infectious diseases. So we must spend a whole lot of monies on research and development to put us in a better position to respond to some of these crises in the future. And I think it also puts us in a position where we learn the difficult part of governance, where governance is simply not about building rules or issuing contracts. It's about improving the Human Development Index of the people, and that would include the health and welfare of the citizens of the country. And the ability to respond to those things have to do with deliberate economic policies that are broad, that are all-encompassing, and that are inclusive. The crisis have exposed our vulnerabilities in this regard, where we've been unable to extend as much palliatives to the most vulnerable in the society, largely because we do not have data. We've been unable to treat as much people or to test as much people as we would like compared to other neighboring African countries, because we've not developed the capacity to do that over time. Our healthcare workers who are on the front line, many of them are working without adequate PPE. And that's because, again, we've not invested in the safety of our healthcare workers. So you see, all of these things come together to point to a single fact that governance will need to step a notch higher. We need to do a lot more critical thinking, and we need to move away from the idea of governance as simply issuing contracts and collecting monies from Abuja, to taking more responsibility for the life and development of people in our states and in our community. And that way, I think we'll be able to make better progress in the future.
All right, two things I'd like for you to address before we let you go is the aspect of if the easing of this lockdown measures will address the security concerns that a lot of communities within Lagos and Ogun State have witnessed over time. And two, the LCCI, that's the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, has said that about 10 trillion naira has been lost. Do you think that a stimulation of the economy at this point with the easing of the lockdown will help us pick up as fast or as quickly as we can?
I mean, picking up will be gradual. I don't think it will be overnight. I think it's going to be a gradual process. The economy has suffered, has taken a beating. And like you rightfully said, the LCCI puts that about 10 trillion naira. In fact, the jobs that have been lost in the economy are quite staggering. And of course, aviation businesses, hospitality businesses have taken such a huge beating. Worse is the fact that oil prices have collapsed. I think a barrel of oil is going for less than $15, such that the federal government has had to review its entire budget. So we're in a very, very difficult position, and an economy is quite fragile. And I think that is what informed the president's decision to begin to ease off the lockdown. And so, yes, it's going to take a gradual process for us to get back on our feet. But I think it's still, we must still take precaution in terms of opening the economy so that there's still some sort of balance between public health and the economy. And in terms of security, you see, the lockdown only just showed us how vulnerable we have been in the country, because the truth is insecurity has been a real problem in many of our communities across the country. And I think we've said it over and over again, and we've shouted to the rooftop that there needs to be a rejig of our internal security architecture to ensure that the people in charge of internal security can better respond to cases of insecurity within the country. So it's cases of theft, banditry, cultism, and all of that. It's eating up the fabric of our society. And it's not just because of the lockdown. It's the problem, and it's the reality that we deal with every day. I think the lockdown just made the news spread faster, but it's being our daily reality. So there has to be a rejig of the internal security architecture. I think we have to come to the point where we have a very difficult conversation about state policing, and we need to do all that needs to be done to protect life and property of the people. Because as we speak, I do not think that the Nigerian police has enough in its kitty to properly maintain peace and order across the country, because they are truly overwhelmed, they are poorly equipped, they are badly motivated. And I think a lot needs to be done in that direction if we're really going to have safe communities.
All right, Ayodele Adio, thank you so much for speaking with us. You're watching TVC Breakfast, and we're streaming live on YouTube. You can connect with us on Twitter using the hashtag TVC Breakfast.